what I want to talk about in the brief time available is really to pick up some of the themes that Paul Nolan covers in his excellent report on the peace monitoring, which is really related to spatial division and the policies that have been attracted to that issue now for some decades. And I want to look at that in respect of Belfast, but I think some of the implications of it has a region-wide implication and region-wide repercussion. So let me just start with a few things just by way of context. By the way, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so I'm just, this is absolutely clear blue water, but your good health anyway. If we start off just looking at the issue of population in the city across the region, one of the things that's very evident is that over the last decade, Belfast's population has only grown very modestly. I mean, if you take the urban area, for example, you'll see that it's grown at twice the rate. If you take the metropolitan area of Belfast, it's grown at 3 times. And if you take the wider Belfast city region, roughly 30 miles radius of Belfast, it's grown around 5 times, and of course the highest rate for the region as a whole. So although there are variations within different parts of the city and so on, there is a major issue there for the viability and long-term sustainability of a regional capital like Belfast. And I'll come back to that a bit later in the presentation, but I just flag it now as one of the key contexts. Now, that's particularly strong if you compare Belfast with quite similar cities in Britain, particularly cities of the same size, like your Nottinghams and Cardiffs and Leicesters and so on. You'll see that all of these cities, when it comes to the 70s, late 60s, 70s, go in for this, what's sometimes referred to as the urban-rural shift, a hemorrhaging of population out of the main city area into nearby exurbs and wider suburbs. And Belfast, of course, in the red there, has a very dramatic dip in that respect. So there's an awful lot of population loss in Belfast in that period. But the difference is that if you look at the other cities in more recent times, particularly over the last decade, many of them are starting to rise again. And there are varied reasons for that. In many cases, it is to do with immigration and other factors. But in Belfast, you can see that the population is more or less flatlining. And so the kind of changes that we're going to look at in the presentation are within that context of relatively stable population overall in the city. And there are, as I say, questions in relation to that. Now, in the wider city region, you can see this played out in terms of the orange and green factor. This is in relation to the questions on community background, what religion were you brought up in kind of question. And you can see straight away from that visual that most of the numerical increase in population in most parts of this area are on the Catholic side. And in many parts you'll see a Protestant decline, really with the exception of the southwest areas of Banbridge and Craigavon. This is within the city region area. So again, a lot of variations if you focus in on smaller parts of it, but that's a general pattern which I think is notable. Now, when we come to Belfast itself, as has been mentioned earlier, there is now a question that both asks people what religion they want to state, but also maybe a more interesting question of what is your community background? Even if you feel at the moment you don't have a religious affiliation, what kind of community were you brought up in? And we can see the difference here over the last decade very clearly. That on the Catholic side, there's been a modest increase in percentage from 47 to 49. But on the Protestant side, there's been quite a significant decrease from 49% in 2001 to 42%. And an increase correspondingly with those that say, you know, none of those. Now, some of that can be explained again by immigration, which again I'll keep referring to. But obviously, it is surmised that maybe a slightly higher share of Protestants are tending not to answer that question compared to Catholics. But one of the things that we might deduce from that is that Belfast is, roughly speaking, in terms of our two main communities, breaking up into 50-50 share of the city. And within that context, then, of where we are now, If we look back over the last 40 years or so as to how that plays out in segregation within the city, then there are three main patterns that we need to keep in mind. The first is that where the deepening segregation came, the real hardening of segregation, were in the 2 decades of the 1970s and the 80s. And there were three dramatic things that were happening during those decades. And the coming together of those three had this dramatic impact. And what I'm going to suggest later on is that in the absence of those kind of dramatic factors, are we likely to see any major reverse in this pattern of segregation? And the three factors were, I think everybody's familiar with them, is that in the late 60s, the government of the time set about a major economic restructuring of the region. And part of that related to the development of new town areas like Craigavon and Antrim and so on, with all the relevant infrastructure. And there was a big effort to attract particularly the more skilled people to the new economic opportunities of those areas. So there was a deliberate policy of demagnetizing Belfast as part of this economic modernization. At the same time, there was comprehensive redevelopment going on in Belfast, particularly in the more working class inner city communities, basically demolishing lots of those old areas and replacing it with new housing, largely taken over by the housing executive. So that massive movement of population that accompanied redevelopment, because there was less density put back in many cases, it was roughly half of the inner city households that went in terms of those 2 decades. And then thirdly, of course, was the factor of the violence itself, the intense period of violence, something that Mike's referred to in his own statistics. That early period of the 1970s and early 80s in particular was a push factor, pushing a lot of those who could move out of particularly the inner city area to safer areas and often outside Belfast itself. Now, those are three major things that are not likely to occur again in that way. And they caused the big factor in intensifying segregation. So the obvious question is, without those kind of dynamic forces, is there any prospect, if you don't do anything else, of reversing that degree of segregation? Now, what happened in the 1990s, as we know, was a stabilisation of this. This is a map of Belfast. You can see the very familiar orange and green patterns here. Part of it is divided by the river, orange east, growing green west, a more patchwork situation in the north, and more mixed situation in the south. And segregation stabilised during that kind of period. Didn't change a great deal. But interestingly, and this is reflected again in Paul's report, over the last decade, if we take ward analysis on the census information, there has actually been a modest but significant decrease in segregation across the region as a whole and also in Belfast. And there are obviously varied explanations for this, and we'll get into some of them perhaps in the later discussion. But if I can just illustrate one pattern, this is a super output area in Ravenhill Ward in the east of the city. And interestingly, there has been quite a dramatic increase in the share of the Catholic population, those identifying themselves as Catholic, in this particular super output area. Quite a dramatic Protestant decrease. I can give you the figures later if anybody wants. And obviously, part of the factor is also a significant presence of immigration in this particular area. But it is a situation where in this part here, if you can see, particularly what was the old bakery here, converted into apartments, a lot of new houses built here, this area here in white, undergoing planning permission for more housing and so on. There was in this particular super output area quite a lot of new housing movement. And so that is part of the explanation why we get that transformation. So there are particular places, even in Belfast, even in places that we might not suspect, like East Belfast, where there has been real increase in what we would regard as integration, particularly if viewed at the ward level. But if you go to somewhere like North Belfast, you get maybe an understanding of how nuanced and differentiated this particular pattern can be. North Belfast, as many of you know, has a long-standing reputation of being something like a patchwork quilt. You know, the idea is that many Protestant Catholic communities sit cheek by jowl with each other in close proximity of very small geographies. But behind that truth is the reality that along its main arterial routes, you do start now to get very fixed patterns. Along the Shore Road here, you can see largely orange. Along the Antrim Road here, largely green stretching out. And when you come then to the Crumlin Road, it's a mix of both. And we shouldn't be surprised at the moment that that reflects itself in a civil rights camp at Trudell Avenue, because every little piece of territory on that road is now being fought for in an acute way. And there they're talking about something like 100 yards of whether certain groups should be able to pass them in certain conditions and so on. But even in North Belfast, you're starting to see those bigger patterns. But it's particularly true when you move away from ward analysis, because all of this issue of segregation depends very much on the spatial unit of analysis that you're using. So if you break up wards into the next spatial unit down that is often used, called the super output area, which is roughly, usually about 2,000 or so people, then you can see that there is something much more problematic, much more differentiated going on. And I've chosen for illustration here to take 4 wards. They happen to be in North Belfast, but there are other examples across the city. And if you look at them, they appear to be mixed. They would come out as examples of what Ian Shuttleworth's work on desegregation is indicating, right? But when you break them down into super output areas, say you take Ligoneel here, and I know it's hard maybe to see this fully at the back, but if you break them down into super output areas, you see in fact that they are various shades of orange and green. When you get into smaller areas, you still get the sectarian blocks of geography. And even if you go to somewhere, say like Fort William, say you take the Fort William super output area 3 as it's called, again, looks on paper even there to be relatively mixed as a super output area. But if you actually know the geography and you look closely at the geography, that mix is actually an intensive spatial unit of Catholics towards the Antrim Road end and an intensive unit of Protestants towards the Shore Road end. So what I'm saying is that behind what appears to be the good news of some degree, however modest, of desegregation, lies the reality that when you get down to smaller geographies, which is where segregation often takes shape, then it's not quite often as rosy. Now, I say this in passing because I want to return to it, and I hope that we will return to it in the later discussion at the end of the afternoon. What is now well known, and what has been often stated, and Mike referred to it as well at the start, is that we can no longer assume that people's religious affiliation equates to any particular political allegiance. It's not certainly as simple as it once was. And there is a question now, for the first time in the census, 2011 census, about cultural identity, which has some parallel, some resonance with political identity. And you can see there that when people were asked to identify their identity, 40% identified British, 25% Irish, 21% Northern Irish, which was interesting for a lot of people, and then 9% some permutation of that, you know, they were British and Irish or whatever, and then 5% who didn't declare any of those, might be again immigrants, might be others as well. Now, interestingly, just as a more recent reflection of some of that, there has been a poll in the Belfast Telegraph that many of you might have seen, and it captures maybe some change that has happened over the last 12 months when we've had a return to street violence and so on. But it slightly shifts, in some cases, you know, significantly shifts this. But if we take this, and it's a reasonably statistically accurate poll as far as polls are concerned, the interesting thing to me is that it really breaks down now into a third, a third, a third. A third who see themselves as solidly British, a third who see themselves as some kind of Irish, and a third who are either saying, look, I don't give a damn what the whole thing is. I'm fed up with the whole thing, and I don't want to be categorized in any of these terms, or I'm not sure, no strong opinion, whatever. All right? A third, a third, a third. That's interesting if that has any reflection in the long term. But what it means is the headline that has been said before is that we're all minorities now. The old way of thinking about this place as minority and majority and what way would the shift and so on, that now, even though the situation is fluid, that is not any longer as simple. Now, some people would say, well, that's very positive, you know, because that has the potential, if really the politicians wake up to it, of shifting the political ground, making it more pluralist, making it more open, and engaging lots of new ideas beyond the conventional sources of identity and conflict. But I think by the same token, without being pessimistic about it, that when you get to these very, very tight situations in populations like this, the situation could potentially become more acute, at least in the short term, because everything is being fought for, right? But I think to stay with the positive, what it seems to me to be saying, and this is where I'm going to be interested in your own views later, because I'm going to be suggesting the ways in which we need to rethink key policies, and we need a reconstituted politics to allow us to do some of that. Now, the question for us is, does this signal the prospect of some reconfiguration of political positions? Well, in this way, I think it should, whether it does or not. It should in the sense that if you are British, and if your key political drive is to maintain the Union, you cannot do that by simply appealing to your core constituency. And if you go in for dog whistle politics of getting those issues that mobilise and unite your core constituency, you're going to risk losing potential support in other constituencies that you actually now need to get. And similarly, if you are a Republican and you think all you have to do is sit back and wait for the religious demography to come your way, no. You have to realise that the Irish vote, if that's what we want to call it, is something that has to be won. Now, in that, I think we are potentially at a situation where the politics of persuasion could replace the politics of coercion. And particularly if groups feel, political groups feel, they have to actually persuade others to their position beyond their core constituencies, then the potential for a different kind of politics might be embryonically there. Now, the other feature of this, before I get on to the policy side, and it echoes a little bit of what Mike has just referred to, and it certainly is reflected again in Paul's report, is this link, long-standing link, and it's very evident in Belfast, between deprivation, spatial areas of deprivation, and those areas that are the most segregated. And one of the interesting things I want to talk about is these are wards, the most deprived wards. And you can see, I only go back to 91 here, but if you had more room right across, if we go back to the mid-70s, 40 years ago, to the Bowl Index that underpinned a particular strategy at that time, the Belfast Areas of Need strategy. And we took it from that point of the Bowl Index, the Townsend Index, the Robson Index, the first Nobel Index, the second Nobel Index. The thing that comes across is the relative immutability of these spaces in terms of their ranking in the league table of the most deprived. As you can see there, even over the last 20 years, relatively little movement. The most deprived spaces, even though, of course, their populations have changed to some extent, but as spaces, they have remained stubbornly the most deprived. And they are also, as you can see, in both Protestant and Catholic terms, dominant in terms of wards and so on, they are the most segregated. So there is something about segregation that has a relationship to multiple deprivation. And let's remind ourselves when we talk about multiple deprivation what we're talking about here. We're not talking exclusively just about income. We're talking about housing issues. We're talking about health issues. We're talking about educational underattainment issues. And all of this is tied together. Now, again, it might be useful for our discussion this afternoon. What is this relationship between being in the most segregated areas and being in the most deprived areas? And clearly it's complicated. But in my view, and from certainly the qualitative work we do in lots of these areas, it's evident to me that at least part of it is that when people are in segregated areas, they have an enclosed and enclaved mindset as regards the opportunities of the rest of the city. And some of this can be, quite simple, and maybe even at times quite pathetic. I mean, we went in on one recent occasion to the New Lodge area in North Belfast, very deprived area, always ranks and so on here. And we set out a map, and we had done some work on the map in terms of walking distance to major facilities and other kinds of opportunities in the city. And we took a few quick examples with the community group concerned. Now, if you take, say, a simple thing like the Grove playing fields is about 10 minutes from the New Lodge. So you ask people, would you be happy having your children go to the Grove playing fields? No. Why not? Well, they have to pass through Skigganeal. We wouldn't be happy with it. So there's something, obviously, about the way these communities have become enclosed. And we know that the segregation of the 70s in particular was highly related to issues of violence, issues of security. But the legacy of that, the enclosed legacy of that, has cordoned off lots of opportunities, lots of mental maps for people who live in these areas with, I think, devastating effects. Now, I want to get back to this issue here because I'm going to come on to this in the last part of what I want to say. What we have to wake up to is that after 4 decades of intervention around urban deprivation in somewhere like Belfast, the BAN project, the BAT project in the early 80s, moving on to making Belfast 1, moving on to making Belfast 2 in the mid-90s, moving on to neighbourhood renewal in the new decade afterwards, more recently now talking about the social investment areas. Despite all of these interventions, in more recent years that have been complemented by urban programs like European programs like Urban, Poverty 2, interventions by the IFI, Atlantic Philanthropy, more recently the big lottery and so on. There's been endless interventions in these same areas over 4 decades, and yet it has made appreciably little difference to the relative ranking of these areas and things. Now, it's like Einstein's definition of insanity. You cannot do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So you have to conclude, if you want a radically different result, you have to do something radically different to what we have been doing. Now let me illustrate it just in closing then with 2 examples that I think are hallmark examples of the way spatial intervention needs to change. One of the areas that we do some work in is a loyalist area in North Belfast. It's led by a prominent loyalist as a community worker there, Billy Hutchison, and it's called Mount Vernon. Some of you may know it. Now, look at the interesting thing straight away about Mount Vernon, right? You see this little plaque here, if you can see it right to the back? It says, Mount Vernon welcomes you, right? So that's the first thing you see, actually, as you go immediately to it. But here's what you really see, the murals on the wall. And when we had some postgraduate architecture and planning students, going there, I said, take a photograph of that, Mount Vernon welcomes you, and take a photograph of that. And we went into the first meeting with the group, and we put the photographs on the table, and we said, look, straight away, the first thing you need to do is to decide which of these messages really reflects what you want to be about. Do you want to connect into the rest of the city? Do you want to be a pluralist, welcoming place with all that implies? Or do you want to be an enclosure of some kind of pure political position? But the point I'm making is that the interventions that we've had, this is Mount Vernon here, the interventions that we have had have tended to focus in on these small geographies. And the paradox often is that because the intervention is proportionate to the indicators of need, many of these areas actually look eagerly for evidence of their need. And they almost get disappointed if the indicators are moving slightly against them in terms of need, because they associate need with getting various kinds of grants and interventions. So it's an example, one of a number of examples that I think is critically important to trying to intervene in deeply divided societies. That there is a paradox of public policy. That you do certain things that maybe in quite normal situations might be virtuous, but in deeply divided situations, they are inadvertently accentuating rather than ameliorating the condition that you're trying to address. So what I'm suggesting is we need to get away from that kind of spatial targeting as an exclusive way to deal with deprivation. If you linked Mount Vernon here with, say, its contiguous community in Fort William, which happens to be more middle class, but also happens to be predominantly Catholic. And if you drew a new line around the map and said, this is the community we're now dealing with in terms of a range of interventions, then you've got the basis of a cross-class situation and a cross-religious situation, with all the new opportunities and assets that that critical mass provides in that context. And that's the sort of way in which we need to be thinking about these interventions. It's not to get away from need and the importance that that attaches, but it's to say that if we deal with need in this ghettoized sectarian geography that we have, then that's one of the problems that you're going to face. Now, let me just end with another quick example, which is the gridlock at Girdwood that we're all familiar with. We did some work in this area 16 years ago, I think it was, where we surveyed a lot of the local contiguous communities about what they wanted to see in Girdwood. Now, the interesting thing was there was a high degree of unanimity, in fact, about any social investment you'd want to see. If you want to convert the prison into some kind of social and cultural centre, great. And in fact, to some extent, they've done that. I went the other week there to see a character doing jailhouse rock in the jail. I don't know whether his mental health actually was but you know, being a big Elvis fan that I am, I went there in all my Elvis gear and so on, you know, for that purpose. So that's great, yeah, that's happened. But all around the rest of it, as you can see, is sterile. You see, and then you've got there, just in the lower Shankill area, you may see the kind of voids and vacancies there. But this particular difficult area here, behind Girdwood itself, and this is Clifton Park Avenue here. Now, the big issue that divided the communities when we surveyed and talked to them was housing. Surprise, surprise. Because housing determines the particular shape and change of the community. They couldn't agree on housing. And in fact, on the Protestant side, they wanted no housing at that point. Right? Now, the position at the moment is, and I know I'm caricaturing it here for the sake of simplicity and time, but it's broadly true, I think. On the Catholic side, people will say, look, it's a no-brainer. There is a substantial housing waiting list in North Belfast. 90% of that waiting list is Catholic. If you're going to abide by principles of need and equality, then you build the houses on an important brownfield site like this, and 90% of them go to Catholics. What's the problem? Right? On the Protestant side, they say, well, first of all, there is a problem with that if you start to extend this Catholic area from Cliftonville towards us, then that's an incursion and trespass as far as we're concerned. But beyond that, they say, if you look at our position, you won't capture the need simply by looking at some kind of static idea of housing waiting list. Our position is a legacy of the past. It's a hemorrhaging of population, particularly the most skilled and most young population of our communities in the Lower Old Park and the Crumlin area and so on. And therefore, for our regeneration, what we need is a proactive situation of building certain houses in an expectation that we'll succeed in attracting back people to make the community more viable and sustainable in the long term. That's our need. And we pitch that need against these other people's needs. Now, I can see arguments on both sides, right? The problem I have is they're gridlock arguments. And if we simply carve it up, which is the way they tried to recently, that you may have noticed, and say, okay, we'll change the percentages a little bit, but we'll get something happening here, and we'll share it out in some way, 60-40 maybe, rather than 90-10 or whatever, right? The idea they still have is to produce exclusively social housing and in blocks of sectarian geography. And that's what we've been doing. And that's not a criticism. I know we have somebody from the housing sector. That's not a criticism of what the housing executive tried to do for 4 decades. But it is to say that the default position in our society is one of social engineering. And the social engineering operates to segregate people socially. I'm talking now about residential organisations, and to segregate them in religious affiliation. Now, if you want to avoid that, surely what we have to stop doing is continuing to reproduce that, to reproduce working class housing segregated from the middle class, Protestant working class segregated from Catholic working class. But that's what we're going to get if we go for the normal approach. I say instead, what you say is, look, this is an important site. It's a symbolic site for obvious reasons. It's an interface site in many ways. But we're not going to simply produce all this social housing congregate here. We're going to go for a mixed use, mixed tenure kind of development of high quality. We're going to attract in a range of people across religious and social groups. And however improbable that seems, given its immediate history, we're going to put the investment in that makes this place attractive. We're going to put subsidies into it in terms of the private housing and all the rest that makes it attractive to have that option. And it's been done in other places. If time allowed, I could go through some examples in places that I've done work in, like Chicago. But that is the turnaround that is needed in this situation. A reversal of the way we approach all of these kind of things in terms of policy. Now, I'll leave you with one central paradox to what I'm talking about, which problematizes the way in which this might work. We are about to, in the next year or so, give back to politicians planning and regeneration powers. You remember they were taken away in '72 because they weren't using them very well in terms of gerrymandering and so on. They're about to get them back. Now, the question I would leave is this. If we want something radically different, can we expect that politicians, most of whom rely on sectarian geography for their electoral arithmetic, to be the very leaders out of sectarian geography? We can maybe discuss that.